Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
History is often written by the victors, leaving behind the silenced echoes of those who suffered in its darkest corners. There are moments in time, buried beneath the grand narratives of progress and patriotism, that hold unspeakable horror, events so dreadful that they were deliberately erased, concealed, or distorted. One such year in American history carries a terrible legacy: 1863. It was a time of war, rebellion, and supposed emancipation, but beneath the surface lay a story of immense cruelty, injustice, and betrayal. The evil of 1863, hidden from the textbooks and national memory, reveals the contradictions at the heart of America's struggle between freedom and oppression. This is a story of bloodshed, deceit, and the weight of unspoken history, a history America wishes you never knew. As 1863 dawned, the United States was embroiled in the Civil War, a conflict that had begun in 1861 and raged fiercely between the Union and the Confederacy. While the war was publicly framed as a battle over the future of slavery, the reality was far more complex. President Abraham Lincoln, often idealized as the great emancipator, issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, declaring that enslaved people in Confederate states were henceforth free. But what history books fail to mention is that this decree did not apply to the border states that remained loyal to the Union, leaving hundreds of thousands in bondage, even as Lincoln was hailed as a liberator. The proclamation, rather than being a purely moral decree, was a strategic move to weaken the Confederacy and bolster the Union's cause. The grand narrative of emancipation masks the uncomfortable truth that freedom was not universal, nor was it immediate. Beyond the question of slavery, 1863 witnessed atrocities that have been systematically erased. Among them was the New York City draft riots in July, one of the bloodiest racial uprisings in American history. Sparked by the institution of the first wartime draft in American history, which disproportionately affected the poor and working-class immigrants, the riots quickly turned into a horrifying massacre of black citizens. White mobs, enraged that they were being conscripted to fight in what they saw as a war for black freedom, unleashed their fury on African Americans throughout the city. Black men, women, and children were lynched, beaten, and burned alive. Orphanages housing black children were set on fire, and Union soldiers who tried to restore order were met with violent resistance. The violence lasted for days, and when the smoke cleared, estimates suggest hundreds were dead, though the true numbers were likely much higher. The New York draft riots were a chilling display of racial terror, yet they remain a footnote in history, overshadowed by more sanitized versions of the Civil War narrative. Far from the urban centers, the western frontier was also a site of unspeakable horror in 1863. As Union forces fought the Confederacy in the East, they also waged a ruthless campaign against Native American tribes. One of the most brutal acts of genocide occurred in what is now Minnesota and the Dakota Territories, where the U.S. government carried out mass executions, forced removals, and starvation tactics against the Dakota Sioux. After the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862-1863 saw the largest mass execution in American history when 38 Dakota men were hanged in Mankato, Minnesota, on December 26, 1862. The following year, the U.S. government escalated its efforts to eliminate Native resistance, sending military expeditions deep into the Great Plains, destroying entire villages, killing unarmed women and children, and driving survivors into barren reservations where starvation and disease awaited them. These events, whitewashed as westward expansion, amounted to a campaign of ethnic cleansing that has been deliberately omitted from most historical accounts. Another sinister chapter of 1863 was the continued use of slavery under different guises. While the Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved individuals in Confederate states, many former enslavers found ways to circumvent the decree. One of the most insidious methods was through the so-called apprenticeship system, where freed black children were forcibly taken from their families and placed under the control of their former enslavers, often until they reach adulthood. These children, technically free on paper, continued to work in conditions indistinguishable from slavery, enduring brutal treatment and extreme labor exploitation. The federal government, overwhelmed by the logistics of managing emancipation and unwilling to directly confront former slaveholders, allowed this practice to persist. While America celebrates the end of slavery, the reality is that for many, freedom remained a distant illusion long after 1863. Further south, the Confederate government, despite suffering from increasing military defeats, doubled down on its brutality. The infamous Fort Pillow massacre in Tennessee, though occurring in 1864, had its roots in Confederate policies established in 1863. That year, the Confederacy formally declared that black Union soldiers captured in battle would not be treated as prisoners of war, but as insurrectionists subject to execution or re-enslavement. This policy led to systematic killings of captured black troops, as evidenced by later atrocities like Fort Pillow. Confederate forces, particularly under the command of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who would later become the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, became notorious for their ruthless treatment of black soldiers, murdering them even after surrender. These massacres were meant to send a clear message. Black people, even if they wore the Union uniform, were not entitled to the same rules of war as white soldiers. This systemic targeting of black troops is yet another chapter of the war that is rarely acknowledged in mainstream historical narratives. Perhaps one of the most chilling realities of 1863 was the deep entrenchment of white supremacy not just in the Confederacy, but in the Union as well. While Union armies included black soldiers, many white officers and enlisted men harbored deep racist beliefs and resented the presence of African Americans in their ranks. Even within the North, black communities faced systemic racism, exclusion, and violence, making the narrative of a noble fight for freedom increasingly complicated. Lincoln himself, while revered for his leadership, held complex and often contradictory views on race, at times advocating for the colonization of freed black people to Africa or Central America rather than full integration into American society. The myth of the Civil War as a simple struggle between good and evil dissolves when confronted with the reality that racism was not confined to the South. 1863, a year often remembered for progress and transformation, was in truth a time of immense suffering, betrayal, and moral failure. The draft riots, the ongoing genocide of Native peoples, the continuation of slavery under new disguises, the targeted murder of black soldiers, and the deep racial hostility that infected every corner of the nation expose a side of history that America has long sought to forget. It is a history that challenges the myths of freedom and justice, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that even as the nation moved toward emancipation, it did so with blood on its hands. The evil of 1863 was not just in its violence, but in the silence that followed. These atrocities were deliberately erased, buried under the weight of national myths and historical revisionism. To remember them is not to dwell in darkness, but to seek the truth, to ensure that the voices of those who suffered are never lost to time. The past cannot be changed, but its lessons can shape the present. Only by acknowledging the hidden horrors of history can we begin to build a future where such evils are never repeated.